My name is Jocelyn Malamy. I'm an associate professor at the University of Chicago.
And then what made you choose your career path?
Let's see. I think I always had an interest in how things worked. I was particularly interested in plants from an early age. My father is a research scientist, which, as you probably know, is extremely common for women scientists to have a scientist parent. So I was already sort of familiar with the idea of going into research. I think the idea was in my head, and I just sort of followed it, sort of step by step, enjoying each of the steps as I went. So I think that's true of a lot of scientists. You just kind of keep following interesting projects.
So, was there any specific moment in your career that really inspired or motivated you?
I don't know, so science, especially research, is sort of a long game, right? So there's doesn't tend to be that many of those big eureka moments. It's like slow, steady progress in something that you're interested in. Like maybe once every couple of years, there'll be some really exciting result that just sort of makes you feel like you really understand something you didn't understand before. And I think I had those moments, once or twice in graduate school, once as a postdoc, and certainly a few times in my own lab. And those, I think, are the moments that you kind of keep going for. When something exciting happens and you kind of keep, like a very long, slow addiction, where you keep pushing for that next aha moment, when all of a sudden you kind of become obsessed with some very interesting piece of data that you just think about and think about and think about until all of a sudden you realize how something works. And then that's very, very satisfying.
Okay. So, were there any specific people or mentors that made a significant impact on you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so many. I mean, my father, as I said, was a researcher. So, he got me interested in science from the very beginning. And then I had a professor in college who I think got me particularly interested in plant biology. And I did research on plants for many, many years before I switched to the Cnidarian systems. And he was very exciting, and he just, sort of liked asking questions. And then in my graduate lab, I was assigned to work with a postdoctoral mentor. And he's really taught me how to do research and taught me how to ask questions in the right way. So every stage, when you go towards research, it's a very, very long sort of training process. So, many people in college, they start doing a little bit of research, and then graduate school is training. And then postdoctoral work is like sort of another level of training. So at each of the stages, you have many mentors. You have the professors whose labs you're working in, and you have, the more senior people who are, teaching you things at every step. And then, even as a faculty member, you're learning all the time. So there's people that really impress you, and you say, boy, I want to be like that.
So, when you initially entered this field, were there any struggles that made you reconsider your career choice? And if there were, how did you push through that?
So I don't think I ever reconsidered it while I was a student or a postdoc, because those in a way are very charmed years where you are pretty much left alone just to do research and to learn and be with a whole lot of other people who are also doing research and learning. And it's a very exciting time. And then you just get this point where you just want to have your own lab and have your own students. So I don't know how relevant this is, but when you take a faculty job, all of a sudden you have a lot of responsibilities that are constantly pulling you away from your science. You have administrative duties and teaching duties. And then the biggest thing is that you're always applying for funding. So I don't know if you know this, but academic research is one long slog of trying to keep your research funded. So when you get an academic position, in most places, most of your salary is covered. So you're not at risk of suddenly being out of the job, and you're provided with a lab space, but beyond that, very little is covered. So if you want to have graduate students or postdocs or technicians to work in your lab or buy supplies to do the research with or any of these things, that's money you have to raise yourself. And most people raise that money from government grants. And government grants are very, very, very competitive. And it is not unusual for people's projects that they really hold dear to just not be fundable, especially things that are new or different or risky. So I certainly had a long period. It's actually why I switched fields. It became more and more difficult to get plant research funded. And I got very discouraged with trying to get the projects that I was excited to do in plant biology funded. And it just kind of seemed a little on the hopeless side. You get very excited and you write a grant and proposal and plan some experiments, and you just can't do them. So I think that takes out a lot of researchers these days, is the funding situation. But instead, I just kind of did a pivot to a whole different area, and I'm still in the middle of that pivot, and that's the jellyfish work that I'm doing now. And then what I ended up doing, I guess also to address that problem, is I took on a position as an associate dean here at the college. So in addition to my research, I also manage the undergraduate curriculum in biology for the college students, and that in part supports my lab.
Like getting your research funded sounds like a really challenging experience. If any, what adversaries have you faced because of your gender or background?
I mean, I think in biology, I don't think that I've ever come into a situation where I feel I was discriminated against as a woman. Certainly in, general meetings, I think as in business, also in academia, there is always a little bit of a struggle with how women approach things to get their voices heard versus the way men approach things to get their voices heard. So I think as in all careers, that is always a little bit of a struggle. But I don't particularly blame anybody for, intentionally ignoring or I don't feel that ever happened. There's lots of women in biology and faculty positions and high level positions, so they're not all that underrepresented. That said, I think, women face some tough choices. And so like in college, I think there's more women in biology than not. In grad school, it's around the same. Postdoc, probably still a lot, but then it starts to go down and down and down. And then women who have tenure in biology is then considerably less than men. And I don't have the research at my fingertips to know exactly why people think that is. My guess is that a lot of it has to do with balancing, work and family. I think the struggle probably everybody faces in all careers is, for women, why can't I have it all? Men can have it all. Men can have their families and their work and their careers, and why can't women? And the answer is, nobody's sort of stopping us, except, when you have children and you have a family, it just takes a lot, not only of your time, but also of your mental time. There's something that you really want to focus on and think about, so children are not just a thing to be a time management problem. They're, very much a huge part of everything about your life. And so it's very, very difficult to have that kind of a family and also be sort of at the top of your career. I think still the women that I know who are really much more successful than myself, really sort of at the top of the field in biology, tend not to have children. And I think that that's, among my colleagues also the case. Many of them do not have children. So to some extent, I think it's a little bit of a trade-off. The women that I know who are most successful and have children have husbands who are in less driven, ambitious careers. And they sort of take on more of that load of keeping the family going. So that of course can work, but somebody has to be doing it or else, and then you sort of think at the end of the day, do I want to feel guilty that I did a little less research or feel guilty that I didn't raise my children right? And nobody wants to feel like they didn't raise their children right. So I think that's still what the work balance problem is still, sort of what we all struggle with. And I think it's, still sets women back a lot, no matter how wonderful a partner they have. The woman is still the mom. And especially when the kids are little, no matter fairness or what it should or shouldn't be aside, the mom is the mom, and nobody can really replace you in terms of time or effort. And that's important stuff.
Yeah, I know that you kind of just went over balancing your family and your work, but what do you perceive to be the largest barrier or obstacle to female leadership?
In academia, I would say that there's a lot of female leaders. So in biology, I don't think I see there to be a big barrier. Certainly at the administrative level, the level of deans and provosts and even university presidents, there's a lot of women. Chairs of departments, there's probably less women, but still I know quite a lot. Successful women scientists at the top of their field who are well respected, I know a lot. So I don't feel that there's external forces, as in people not recognizing the value of women, keeping women from achieving.
So why do you think that diversity is important in a workplace?
I mean, again, I can only speak from academia. That's where I've sort of spent my career, sort of working on its way up at the college level, on the teaching level. As everybody knows, it's very important for students to see all types of people as their teachers and role models. There's all sorts of subconscious messages that are sent with only seeing, certain kinds of people held up before you as, as successful in the career or as teaching you in the field that you're interested in. So it's very important to have a diverse teaching body where all students can find people like themselves. I think that the most important thing is that there be opportunities, equal opportunities for everybody to find their place in all careers. I'm not one of the people who think that we have to force exact even ratios of everybody that we can think about. And I don't think there is such an example, but were there an example where more men than women were just interested in something, I don't really think that that's something we have to fight against. If women don't feel they have access to it, or if African Americans don't feel they have access to it, then that's something that we have to fix. But, so I think it's important to sort of look at the example and figure out if there's not diversity, why is there not diversity? And sometimes it can be okay, sometimes it's not. I don't really believe in hiring practices that try to force a particular kind of diversity that's numerically equal. I think that's not really the right approach. But, I do believe in figuring out if there's sort of invisible barriers at any level and trying to make sure that they're not there.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I think equal opportunity is a lot better than like equal outcome. And you kind of mentioned like your plant research and how like you pivoted over to, I think, jellyfish. Could you give me like a quick overview of your research?
Oh, sure. About 10 years ago, I started the jellyfish work, and then I got so interested in it that little by little I phased out the plant work. So I've always been interested in the process of regeneration, and it's one of the things that we were studying in plants. And so plants, a very fundamental question, right? If you cut off a piece of a plant, it can grow the whole plant back. And even if you cut away a little tiny, tiny bitlet of a plant and you give it the right nutrients and culture, it can grow the whole plant back. And this is called totipotency. It means that any one piece of tissue has all of the information in it to regenerate a whole organism. And there are very few things in the animal kingdom that can do this in the way that the plant kingdom can do it. Nevertheless, if you look at the animal kingdom, there are lots and lots of animals that to some extent have some abilities of regeneration. Even we can regenerate like the tips of our fingers in some cases. If you cut off a little bit of the finger, it can grow back. But then there are animals that can regenerate whole organs, or can regenerate big chunks of their hearts, And then there are certain animals, like if you cut off the tail will come back, right? Or frogs and salamanders, if you cut off the limbs will grow back. So one of the sort of the big questions in science is, why can some animals do this and other animals can't do this? And one way of sort of understanding that is to figure out how the animals that can do it. And then you can look and see what's missing in higher animals. That's kind of a big career-long question. Some of the animals that are the most regenerative are the simple animals. So regeneration has actually been lost rather than gained. And the cnidarians, which are the sea anemones and the corals and the jellyfish, are some of the most regenerative organisms, sort of akin almost to the plants in their ability to grow big chunks of themselves back. So I got interested in that idea of looking for a very highly regenerative animal to kind of be a parallel to the kind of questions we were asking about regeneration in plants. And at that time, an article had just come out in a journal called Trends in Genetics that had this picture of Cladia hemispherica on the cover. And this group in France were developing it as a new model system. And it had a lot of traits that just made it very, very cool. So I asked them to send me some, and they did. And we started looking at it under the microscope, kind of cutting it apart and seeing what happens. And what happens if you cut it in half, you get 2 jellyfish. And if you cut pieces off of it, it regenerates those pieces with no trouble at all, incredibly fast. And then as we started watching and studying this process, what we also noticed is that the skin of the jellyfish, if you wound it, you can see in exquisite detail the cells moving along the surface to reclose that wound in the skin. And that's something I got fascinated by. It's almost impossible to see that in adult animals of almost anything else. There's a lot of reason that jellyfish, being small and transparent, and they have this super simple skin that just microscopically you can sort of watch this in real time. And I saw what I still feel is a real potential of having a very primitive animal that's kind of at the beginning of multicellularity, but can already heal things in a way that looks an awful lot like the way we heal things, but that you could watch in real life and studying it there. So we spent a couple of years developing tools and learning how to work with the animals, learning how to keep them alive in Chicago, characterizing what wound healing looked like. If you looked at our website, you've seen some of those movies maybe. And then we started looking for signaling pathways that play roles in vertebrates and asked if some of those signaling pathways were there in jellyfish, and finding that they are. And using those tools to sort of see if we could figure out how they work a little bit. That's the main focus of my lab. We also are trying to, in collaboration, figure out how stinging cells in jellyfish sting, which is a super cool project because they have cells that trigger stinging that are very similar to the cells that we have in our inner ear that trigger hearing. That's the second project that we do. And then I'm here at the Marine Biological Laboratory for the summer studying how microbial signals trigger life cycle development in jellyfish. So that's yet a different direction too.
That's really cool. I've heard of the immortal jellyfish, I guess, like the one that just keeps like regenerating. And I think that's just like crazy.
Yeah, that one doesn't only regenerate, but if you sort of poke it and mess it up enough, it actually goes backwards in the life cycle. So normally you sort of start with a polyp, and then that polyp releases medusa, which are the jellyfish you picture. But I think the way that goes is that if you mess with the medusa enough, it sort of makes this little lump and goes back to being a polyp. So there's nothing that kind of should go backwards like that. And what it really is that these organisms, they have a real amazing power to just sort of reorganize themselves. Like Hydra, you can completely dissociate them so that you have a whole pile of single cells, and then you can watch them kind of come back together and organize themselves and make a Hydra out of those cells again.
Yeah, that's so cool. Like, what type of traits do you think define a great researcher? What type of traits would you look for if like you're trying to select someone for your lab?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'm a great researcher. I think I'm a good researcher, but I know a lot of people who are a lot better. And if I knew their secret, I'd maybe be better myself. You know, you certainly have to have persistence and clarity and, sort of the ability to find the right questions and to find the right approaches to those questions. And sometimes that's not really obvious how to do that. These days you also have to sort of be kind of the same kind of person who would run a successful small business, which in a way a lab kind of is. You have to sort of have an ability to be a great leader and motivate the people in your group. I don't know that I have those skills either. So, there's a lot of things that happen. They also often are highly charismatic people, as in all fields, and are able to bring in funds by just getting everybody excited about their work. So I think I'm good at all those things, but not great. Great people can do all those things really, really well. I think the people that I take in my lab, so we take people at all levels in my lab, right? So I always have undergraduate students in the lab. I have a time and high school students in the lab through one of the programs we run at U Chicago. I find it very difficult to predict who's going to be good or not good at that experience level. So pretty much I take people on almost a first come, first served basis as long as they express enthusiasm. I mean, I turn a lot of people down because I have a small lab and only a small amount of space, but very rarely do I meet someone who I will say, no, this person's can't do it. That almost never happens. But what happens is people get, especially at the young level, is people get into the lab and then it becomes obvious really, really quickly if they're going to be researchers or good at research or not. And you teach them some techniques for an experiment you want them to do, and you set them up to do it. And they will either get completely addicted to it and just want to work at it. And when it fails, do it again and try it again and think about things. And they just become kind of lab rats. The college kids just end up doing their homework there and being there in between class so that they can keep an eye on their experiments. So people either just become part of the lab or they're just trying to do it like a class. You can't really do that. People who just kind of get into it and sort of start living it, those people are always going to be good. And we all look at each other and say, okay, now this is one of us, this person's going to be fine. And then that becomes sort of a mentoring task. And I think, everybody comes in different. Some people come in full of ideas and they need a little bit of help reining in those ideas to make something really happen. Like, it's a lot of fun to just kind of dabble in stuff, but at the end of the day, you want to have rigorously done some experiments multiple times so that at the end you can say, okay, this I really proved, as opposed to kind of looked at all this cool stuff, So some people just have to be taught, exactly what is required before you can say something. Like, this is caused by this, what that act, or this happens when I do this to my system. So that's a lot. Other people have to be kind of encouraged the opposite direction. Other people need to be sort of told exactly what to do, and you have to sort of encourage them to be brave and be a little exploratory and just try stuff, So some people are too much one way and some people are too much the other way. Like, I'm at MBL. I don't know if you've heard of marine biological laboratories. Yeah, I mean, they run, sort of research courses where they do exactly that. They sort of get students out of classrooms and out to the bench and say, I don't know if this is going to work. Go ahead and try it. And that's such a different thing for young people to hear than they hear in school, that at first it's scary, but for many of them, it's really transformative, and they just kind of see what science is all about. It's just sort of trying stuff.
So what type of skills do you think that high schoolers can develop even if they don't have access to like a wet lab?
I think they can read. I think that's probably the best thing to do, is to read sort of widely about, any aspect of biology that excites them. And even in generalist journals, it doesn't have to be Science and Nature. It can be, National Geographic and, things that are more written for newer scientists are fine. And watch, documentaries and try and get your handle around the kind of questions that people can ask in science, to sort of picture what it means to do science and to just see if it excites them. I don't know what your high school science is like. There's a lot of high school curricula that I feel kind of beat the excitement out of it. Anything that students can do to kind of see the fun. Science is really supposed to be fun. It's looking at stuff in the water. It's cutting things up and seeing what's inside. It's adding things and seeing what things do.
Yeah, so really just exploring your own interests.
exploring your own interests and trying to sort of see the reality of those interests, like what people in those areas, are doing. And you can, these days, you can see websites of like every famous scientist that there is. So, if you look around for scientists that are doing research in an area of interest, they'll have like a one-page description of their research on their front page. There's also something called iScience, which are, YouTube videos with scientists introducing their own work and the stuff that's in their field. iBio, it's called. And when I switched fields, I learned a lot from watching iBio videos. They're the people that you would want to learn from explaining the basics of their field. I mean, that's another resource that I think high school students have, is you have access to all these great seminars by scientists.
And then for our final question, what advice would you give to other people who want to enter your career field?
I would say that in high school, it's out of your control, really, how much access you have to opportunities. But once you get to college, in many colleges, there's opportunities to do some sort of research with your science professors. And if there is that opportunity, those are opportunities that you want to try and get. And for people who go to schools that don't have any sort of research opportunities, there's summer internships and all sorts of REU programs that they can join and be paid for. There's lots of ways in which people can get a little bit of research experience in college. And that's, I think, tremendously important. There's very little you can learn in class that prepares you for what research is really like. So just kind of getting in a lab, even just as a helper, I think is probably the most important thing. It's also the thing that will allow you to get into graduate school if that's the direction one is going. That can be tough to get that first job when you're out of college. So all of it is just a continuum. Try to do some research in college. If you still like it, try and get some sort of a research technician position and work in a lab after college. If you still like it, go to graduate school. If you still like it, keep on. I would say on the other side that research, it's like I said, it's long, it's slow, it's not particularly lucrative, and it's too hard if you don't love it. It's not worth it if you don't like it, so just try it and be honest with yourself and see if that really seems like something that you would want.
Yeah. So that's all the questions that I have for today. And thank you so much for meeting with me.
Sure. I hope it was helpful.